Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Thanks for the introduction, Dan, and thanks for everyone who I've talked to today and who's come to this talk. It made me feel very welcome here, so thank you guys. And yeah, like Dan said, I'm interested in sort of climate and hydrologic questions, especially in terrestrial landscapes in the recent past, so mostly the Lake Quaternary. And thinking about how climate and hydrologic change have sort of given rise to modern landscapes and ecosystems. So today I'm going to be sharing work mostly from my PhD and a little bit after that, thinking about Andean climate and hydrology over the last 650,000 years from sediment cores from Lake Junín, Peru. So as you've probably gathered already, the key player in today's talk will be Lake Junín, which is located in the central Peruvian Andes. And the talk is broken up scientifically into two parts. So in the first part, I'm going to be talking about interglacial intervals from the Lake Junín core and linking global climate, South American monsoon, and local water balance in the Andes. And then in part two, we will be looking at, glacial intervals reflected by the core. Okay, so to get into some background. Like I said, I'm interested in the terrestrial water cycle, and as you guys all are aware, the terrestrial water cycle shapes our ecosystems and our land surfaces. It also provides a feedback on global climate through atmospheric water vapor, and it can even influence sediment transportation and geomorphology of different landscapes. So we'll be talking about South America today, and I expect you guys are all sort of probably already familiar with some of these like ecoregions that have really different sort of distributions of surface water and surface hydrology. So the Amazon basin in the lowlands of tropical South America is this warm, wet, low relief environment. Moving west, the Andes hug the sort of western side of South America. These environments are much colder, generally a bit drier, high elevation. And then directly sort of at the Pacific margin is the coastal desert, which we won't really talk about today, but is a hyper-arid area and home to very large population centers like Lima, Peru, which is home to over 11 million people. So there's a lot of different sort of hydrologic conditions experienced across the continent. And to a first order, these different distributions of environments follow precipitation patterns in the continent. And the distribution and timing of precipitation across this sort of low latitude region that we'll be looking at today, the tropics and the subtropics, is largely influenced by the South American summer monsoon. And the South American summer monsoon sort of originates in the tropical Atlantic and brings moisture over the continent before sort of exiting in southeastern South America. And the monsoon itself follows a very seasonal pattern related to changes in solar insolation over the course of a year. So in this schematic, I'm showing austral summer, or when the southern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, and this occurs at perihelion, or when we're closest in our orbit to the sun. And what we basically get is really intense solar insolation or solar energy over the low latitude southern hemisphere. And this ends up creating a thermal gradient that leads to convective rainfall patterns over the South American tropics, and this is what leads to the monsoon system. Conversely, in the other sort of end member of our annual cycle in the northern hemisphere summer, this most intense solar radiation occurs in the northern hemisphere, and these convective rainfall cells sort of move into the northern hemisphere. And so we end up having weaker monsoons in the southern hemisphere during this time. And we see this reflected not only in my sort of schematic, but in instrumental precipitation data from the last few decades. And so you can see that in the southern hemisphere winter, we end up getting relatively little precipitation over this monsoon domain. And in the austral summer, so this is December, January, and February, we get lots of precipitation in this monsoon domain, represented here by these darker colors. So this is thinking about sort of changes in precipitation over an annual cycle. But what we're interested in thinking about is changes in precipitation and water cycle dynamics on longer periods of time. And so when we're thinking about sort of millennial to orbital scale periods of time, the main driver on these monsoon systems are Milankovitch cycles in different orbital configurations. So these can change the monsoon intensity on longer periods of time. And so since we're in the Earth Science department, I think that probably most of you are familiar with Milankovitch cycling. So 3 major parameters being eccentricity, or the ellipticity of Earth's orbit around the sun, following about 100,000 year cycle. Axial tilt or obliquity, so this is the tilt of our rotational axis, and then precession, which is sort of our wobble around our orbital axis. So for today's talk, we're really going to be focusing on precession, this approximately 23,000 year cycle, and orbital eccentricity, 100,000 year cycle, and thinking about how both of these orbital parameters can influence the monsoon. So we'll first look at precession. And so here in this schematic, I'm showing sort of our present day conditions that we already talked about, where we have southern hemisphere summer at perihelion, and this is when the monsoon is most active. But on this half precessional time scale, so approximately 11,000 years ago, the southern hemisphere experienced summertime at aphelion, so our furthest point in orbit from the sun. And so we still had monsoons active during this time, but overall the South American monsoon would have been weaker than the present day, because we have less of this ability for a meridional temperature gradient to develop. So the role of precession has been sort of documented on influencing the South American monsoon by a number of different studies, but we don't really have the same sense of how eccentricity may have altered the monsoon. And so I'm going to show just a schematic of how we might consider whether eccentricity could have a role on amplifying monsoon extremes. So again, on the left is our present day configuration, and we can think about how this might change if we had much higher orbital eccentricity. So we're basically amplifying the difference between these different configurations. So you get higher solar insolation at perihelion and weaker insolation at aphelion. And so what I'm hopefully going to show you through the talk today is that we think that eccentricity may be a factor that sort of amplifies monsoon variability. It can make the monsoon stronger or weaker, but still following this precession pacing. So this is great, but we need tools to understand how the monsoon has changed in the past. How can we basically tell in the past something about monsoon strength? And so to do that, we're going to be using precipitation stable isotopes, so oxygen 18O. And for those who maybe aren't too familiar with isotopes, this 18O parameter is the ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in our sample, referenced against some standard, and we usually use standard mean ocean water as our reference standard. So in this system, ocean water has a delta 18O value of approximately around 0, and during evaporation we end up with vapor parcels that have been evaporated from the ocean that have negative isotope values. And then where this gets sort of interesting in terms of thinking about the monsoon is that as this vapor parcel moves inland and progressively loses moisture as it goes through these different precipitation steps that are just modeled here, but this is just a numerical model, the isotope value of this precipitation decreases across the continent. And so this is consistent with a Rayleigh distillation pattern. And we can see this in the present day from precipitation isotopes across South America, where we have generally higher precipitation delta 18O values close to the origin of the moisture source, so in the tropical Atlantic. And then we generally see a decrease as we move further in through the monsoon domain, especially as we get convective or orogenic lifting along the eastern flank of the Andes. And so we get sort of this gradient from a higher to lower precipitation isotopes. And we can think about that's under sort of one monsoon condition, but if we have increase in precipitation of strength in monsoon, we might expect to lose more vapor or more moisture during each of these precipitation events. And what this ultimately leads to is an increasing gradient across the continent. So we have much lower precipitation delta 18O values when the monsoon is strengthened. So if we're analyzing or looking at records from sort of these more distal points along the monsoon pathway, the isotope values of precipitation in these regions can help us understand if the monsoon is in a strengthened or weakened phase. And so we'll be looking at not directly at precipitation delta 18O, but proxy records or geologic materials that reflect some information about precipitation delta 18O to learn about monsoon strength. So here I'm showing two of these types of records. These are speleothem calcite delta 18O values, and so it's generally assumed and thought that these calcite 18O records reflect trends in ancient precipitation delta 18O and can be used to understand the monsoon. So here I'm showing two locations, Huacapo Cave in the central Andes and Budavera Cave, which is in sort of southeastern South America. So the site is not necessarily in the monsoon domain, but it's still affected by changes in the monsoon in terms of the isotope composition of precipitation there. And I'm showing, I'll show a couple of figures that sort of are laid out in the same way as this, where we have present day on the left-hand side and going deeper back in time on the right-hand side. And so here showing back to 700,000 years before present. And then the backing color on these panels for the blue are these glacial periods in time based on benthic foraminifera delta 18O, so based on sort of ice volume proxy. So blue glacial periods and white are the interglacial periods, labeled with the marine isotope stage or MIS value or MIS designation for each of those periods of time. And so in this plot, for these higher delta 18O values, remembering that this is corresponding with weaker monsoon conditions, and when we have lower delta 18O values, this is corresponding with stronger monsoon conditions. And what we can see from these speleothem records is that there's some periodic change between stronger and weaker monsoon, and it seems to be happening on some sort of periodic pacing. And we can compare this to summer insolation in the central Andes. So again, this is what we think is it should be linked to monsoon strength. And we can see that the pacing of changes in summer insolation is matching changes in our proxy of precipitation delta 18O, or our proxy of monsoon strength. And furthermore, when we look at insolation, the changes in summer insolation, we can see that the pacing of these changes is corresponding very closely to changes in our precession parameter, which is following that 23,000 year cycle, but that the overall amplitude of change in summer insolation is really affected by eccentricity, so Earth's orbital, the ellipticity of Earth's orbital pathway. So eccentricity is really seeming to modulate the amplitude by which summer insolation is changing. So this is like a great starting point for understanding changes in the South American monsoon and the continental water cycle. But things that we still want to know is whether this connection between the monsoon persisted deeper back in time. So here back to 700,000 years is sort of the end of the mid-Pleistocene transition. So we've started having glacial interglacial cycles on approximately 100,000 year timescales. And so we want to know whether this connection persisted further back in time than 200,000 years, which is sort of where most of the speleothem records are available till. And then we also want to understand, since this monsoon proxy is really indicating sort of regional to continental scale hydrologic change, it doesn't necessarily tell us about what the conditions are like on the ground at, say, a point pretty far along the monsoon pathway. So when the monsoon is in the strengthened phase, does that actually mean it's wetter in the central Andes, or is there not necessarily a connection from the local to sort of regional and continental scale? So we want to explore that as well. And to be doing that, we'll be looking at the Lake Junín sediment record, which goes back just under 700,000 years. And also we think I'll talk about next, we think this record will be really sensitive to changes in local hydrologic conditions. So our study area, like I mentioned, is Lake Junín in the central Peruvian Andes, and you can see the lake and the basin here. So Lake Junín is a high elevation lake positioned on an intermontane plateau, and the lake surface is just over 4,000 meters elevation. So this is 4 kilometers elevation up in the Andes. And the lake watershed is bounded by the eastern and western Cordillera, so these are like the topographic highs of the Andes in this region. And so the lake is on this like large, relatively flat plateau. And the surface area of the lake is quite large. It's about 300 square kilometers, which, just to give you a sense of what that surface area means, is over 50,000 football fields of sort of surface area. But the water depth in the lake is relatively shallow, so it's only about like 8 to 10 meters water depth. So you basically have this very large surface area water body that's very shallow. So any changes in the precipitation amount going into the lake or the evaporative losses from the lake can have a really big effect on the hydrology of the lake and lake water balance. And so today the catchment is fully deglaciated, but there's evidence that the upper parts of the catchment have been glaciated in the past. There have been glaciers in the upper part of the eastern Cordillera, certainly. And then on the right, I'm just showing pictures from I didn't go on this expedition, but ICDP drilling in 2015, when these cores were all collected. So in the next slide, I'll be showing sort of a cross-sectional view of the catchment, such as this. So in the next 2 slides, I'm going to talk about sort of the modality by which sediment accumulates in the lake and what these sediment records represent. So this schematic is showing what we think that the basin would have looked like in an interglacial period, so like today. And like I said, there's no glaciers currently in the catchment today. And so what we have is precipitation interacting with the bedrock, and we end up with a very high dissolved ion load in the surface waters in the catchment that are then transferred into the lake. And when those reach saturation, we produce authogenic minerals like carbonate in the lake. So these are carbonates that are formed from solution, and they reflect the conditions of the water at the time that they formed. During glacial periods, we have, like I said, evidence that there were glaciers in the catchment, and these glaciers are eroding and transporting sediment, and that sediment is being funneled into the lake. This is mostly glacial flour. There's not really evidence that there's like ice rafted debris or drop stones or things like that. So this is all relatively fine-grained glacial flour. And that mostly looks like silts and clays. And in the second part of the talk, we'll be talking about the carbonates in these intervals of the core, which are at least partially derived from detrital carbonates from carbonate in the bedrock. And so those are the 2 sort of modes of sediment accumulation in the lake. And then we can imagine that at the end of a glacial cycle, this whole process repeats itself. And what we end up with in terms of the stratigraphy for the Lake Junín core is this repetition of sediments between carbonates, interglacial carbonates, and glacial, more clastic materials. And so the Junín stratigraphy records this cycle of Pleistocene glacial events over the last 700,000 years. And so we'll be talking about the glacial carbonates first, the interglacial carbonates first, and then the glacial periods second. And we can think about the sedimentology of the core in a slightly more quantitative way as well. And so on the bottom panel here, I'm showing the Junín glacial index, which is the mean z-score of magnetic susceptibility and titanium-calcium ratios in the sediment. And so we expect that these silts and clays that have been derived from the bedrock will have higher magnetic susceptibility and higher titanium-calcium ratios. So when we have a positive value for this z-score for the Junín glacial index, it's indicating that we have more clastic sediment that has entered the lake. And how we interpret that is that that's representing a glacial interval. Versus the carbonates have generally low magnetic susceptibility and low titanium-calcium ratios. And so if we have low z-score, then it means we have less clastic sediment that has entered the lake, and we're interpreting these as glacial periods. And so when we look at the Junín record versus more of these like global and high latitude records, so here the Lisecki and Ramo benthic stack, so thinking about ice volume globally and then high latitude temperatures, we can see that during these interglacial periods, so warmer high latitude temperatures, reduced ice sheets, we're seeing correspondence with the intervals when the Junín core is also representing interglacial conditions. So this is showing that so this record was very exciting when it came out in 2022 in this Rodbell 2022 paper, because it showed that the low latitudes, at least in South America, they're following the same pacing, glacial pacing, as high latitudes. And so the Junín record has become a pretty, in my opinion, premier record of low latitude climate change. And what I'm hoping to do in the rest of this talk is think about how terrestrial climate and hydrologic change have manifest in the low latitudes during the late Pleistocene. So to do that, we're going to be using some isotope approaches, and I want to give a little overview of that now. So earlier I was talking a lot about precipitation delta 18O values as reflecting monsoon intensity. And what you may have already inferred is that we will be looking at the carbonate isotopes to understand something about climate. But how do these two things relate to each other? Well, precipitation can enter the lake either via direct precipitation over the lake or through surface water runoff. And this is one of the leading factors influencing lake water, the isotope composition of lake water, which maybe isn't that surprising. But this lake water isotope composition can be further modified, especially from evaporation. And then, so the lake water is a function of sort of both of these things. And then the lake water isotope composition can be translated into the carbonate as a function of mineralization temperature. So basically we have these three different things that might be influencing carbonate delta 18O values, the things we can actually measure: precipitation, evaporation, and mineralization temperature. And we have a couple tools to sort of help address these different components. And the first I'll be talking about is clumped isotopes, which is a quantitative paleothermometer that'll help us constrain mineralization temperature. And then triple oxygen isotopes, which are a proxy of evaporation. So we'll be talking about clumped isotopes first and how these are a quantitative paleothermometer. So here I'm showing a molecule of CO2, which may have been, like, we would derive this from acid digestion of carbonates, so we would measure CO2 on a mass spectrometer. And for this molecule of CO2, it contains only light isotopes. It has only oxygen-16 and carbon-12, and so it has no substitutions of these heavy isotopes. We can also think about CO2 that has what we call a single substitution, so this having a 13C and this one having an 18O. And when we think about the abundance of these species relative to our no substitutions, that's where we derive something like a delta 13C or a delta 18O value. So we can also think about molecules of CO2 that have what we would call a double substitution. So now we have a 13C bonded to an 18O. And just given how rare both of these heavy isotopes are, we can imagine that it's probable but very unlikely that, or it can happen, but it's very unlikely that we would get this double substitution happening just by random chance. So it can happen, very rare. What we measure with the delta 47 is our observed clumping or our observed double substitutions versus what we would just expect based on random pairings. And ultimately what we see is that at low temperatures, we are more likely, based on thermodynamics and lab observations, we see more clumping at low temperatures and less clumping at high temperatures. So we can relate the 47 value to paleotemperature, or temperature at which the carbonate formed. So our second tool that we'll be using are triple oxygen isotopes, which help us quantify evaporative losses. And so now we're thinking about water, say in a lake. And when evaporation occurs, we preferentially lose those no substitution, those light molecules to evaporation, and the residual water becomes enriched in heavy isotopes. And so we can think about this plotting our delta 18O versus what I call this little 17O parameter. And what we see, what we notice when we look at global data sets is that precipitation has a very consistent relationship between 18O and 17O. So precipitation globally generally will fall along the line I'm representing as this black line here. And during the course of evaporation, we end up seeing sort of a different trajectory. So in a residual lake water that has been evaporated from this initial precipitation value, we end up moving along this lower evaporation slope during the course of evaporation. And we increase our delta 18O value, moving to the right-hand side of the graph here. But relative to the black line, we're moving down. And so that is the parameter that we're thinking about as our big delta 17O or cap delta 17O. And so with more evaporation, we have a lower cap 17O. And then we can also think about if we have our 17O parameter and we know the slope of this evaporation line, we can take a water that has been evaporated and estimate where it used to fall when it was unevaporated precipitation, delta 18O. So we can relate these things together. Okay, so I sort of showed a figure like this already, sort of spatially thinking about how these things relate, and this is a little bit more process related. So if we start with our carbonate delta 18O, we can constrain the mineralization temperature with clumped isotopes, and I won't be showing interglacial temperatures today since they're very similar to the present. And we can estimate or infer what that lake water isotope value was in the past. And then using triple oxygen isotopes, we can constrain evaporative losses. And when we piece this all together, we can even estimate what precipitation delta 18O was in the past from a lake carbonate. And so I'll be showing data we call reconstructed precipitation 18O that's derived from carbonate using this sort of reversing this sort of flow. And then I'll also be showing triple oxygen isotope values as well. So with this first part, looking at our interglacials, just reminding you of sort of the information we have at the outset. We're going to be asking if the South American monsoon tracked insolation beyond the penultimate interglacial, deeper in time than around 200,000 years ago. We're going to also be asking if local water balance tracks the monsoon, again thinking about if there is and what connection there may be between local hydrologic change and these more regional to continental scale changes. And then we're going to be thinking about if the relationships between insolation, the monsoon, and our local water balance conditions changed among different interglacials. And we'll be looking at data from the Holocene and marine isotope stage 15, which was an interglacial around 600,000 years ago. So our first question was if the monsoon tracks insolation beyond the penultimate glacial. And so in this figure, I'm showing our two interglacials we're going to be looking at, the Holocene and marine isotope stage 15. And I'm showing that summer insolation on this right-hand axis. And what we'd expect is if precipitation, we'd expect if the monsoon tracks insolation to see a correlation between these two parameters. And when I show you our data, we can see that our reconstructed precipitation delta 18L, again, this is our sort of monsoon proxy, is really closely tracking summer insolation. And so this is showing that back in time to at least MIS 15, there seems to be a connection between what the monsoon is doing and this orbital forcing. So this really extends for our ability to connect these two parameters back 400,000 years earlier than most of these speleothem records. Okay, so the second thing we wanted to know was whether local water balance, the local conditions on the ground, track changes in the monsoon as well. And so again, we have our insolation curve down here. And I'll be showing our lake water 17.0 value, and so wetter conditions, positive water balance will be upward. And when we look at the data, when we look at the triple oxygen isotope data, again, we see a very close correspondence between local changes in local water balance and this insolation forcing. And so this is highlighting that both the monsoon and local water balance seem to have been in sync with insolation forcing. So for the last couple slides in this section of the talk, we'll be looking at whether the relationships between insolation, the monsoon, and local water balance changed among these two interglacials. So in these plots, this plot I have insolation along the x-axis and our reconstructed precipitation along the y-axis, and so wetter conditions will be upward. And when I show you our data here, our Holocene data are shown with these yellow circles, and our marine isotope stage 15 data are shown with the blue squares. And what we see here is that the regressions and the distribution of reconstructed precipitation delta 18.0 values are really consistent among these two interglacial periods. So this is seeming to show us or say that the monsoon is responding in probably a similar way to insolation changes among these two periods in time, with sort of the caveat that it seems like there may be a larger distribution of values or a bigger range of values during marine isotope stage 15 than the Holocene, and we'll come back to that too. I should also say that this correlation shouldn't really be surprising, given that we saw from our time series graph that there was a tight connection between both of these parameters already. So thinking about now insolation and local water balance, again, we have insolation on the x-axis and our water balance proxy on the y-axis, again with wetter condition upward on the graph. And again, we see a strong correlation between insolation and changes in water balance. But water balance seems to be more interesting in a different way from our monsoon proxy, in that we seem to see overall that marine isotope stage 15 seems to be reflecting wetter conditions than the Holocene. It seems like overall there's a bit of an offset between these two. And even some of these conditions, just for context, precipitation today is around 30 per mil in this region. So some of these lake water values seem to be reflecting like negligible amounts of evaporation during these super wet periods. So there's some distinction between the interglacials that we looked at. And starting to think about why this is, again, now we have, having our water balance proxy on the y-axis now plotted against our monsoon proxy. And we're interested in these seemingly very wet positive water balance periods in marine isotope stage 15. And these, when we plot them against our monsoon proxy, correspond with the intervals when the monsoons seems to be in its strongest phase. So how we interpreted this, again, comes back to these different orbital forcings. So again, we have talked about how precession is having this sort of known effect on changes in the monsoon. And we're postulating that the differences between the Holocene and MIS-15 are really linked to this difference in orbital eccentricity among the two interglacial periods. So having this higher eccentricity gives you these larger amplitude changes in insolation, which we're saying might be related to why we see sort of this expanded range of possible hydrologic conditions at Junín at this time. So to conclude sort of this part of the presentation, we asked these three questions. The first was, did the South American monsoon track insolation beyond the penultimate glacial? And our data is showing that at least during MIS-15, that there does seem to be a connection between the monsoon and insolation. Again, pushing this connection back a few 100,000 years. We also see that local water balance seems to track the monsoon, so suggesting perhaps that there's a connection from sort of local to regional and continental scale to this global forcing, although it'd be also great to test that during other interglacials at other sites and sort of see whether this local water balance connection to the monsoon persists more broadly. And then when we think about the differences between these two interglacials, it seems that precession controls the pacing by which the hydrologic cycle, monsoon, and local water balance changes is driven by precession, but the differences in amplitude between the two interglacials seems to be related to eccentricity, or at least that's our hypothesis. Okay, so in the last bit, I want to talk about the glacial intervals of the core, which, coming back to sort of our view of how sediment accumulates during these periods, we talked a bit about how we're sort of expecting some of the carbonate in this section of these intervals of the core to come from bedrock carbonate. And so this makes it very difficult to use the isotopes, carbonate isotopes from these intervals to say something about climate, because we think that we're mixing the detrital signal in along with any authigenic carbonate that exists. And separating these detrital sediments from the authigenic carbonates has been attempted through a variety of different means, but has ultimately been unsuccessful so far. These images are from Junín, so you can sort of see what this landscape looks like and get a sense for, why we think that there's detrital sediment being input into the lake at this time. So both of these pictures were taken from sort of the southwest portion of the catchment, looking out towards the eastern Cordillera. And you can see these glacial valleys on the landscape today where we, hypothesize that these detrital sediments would have been coming from in the past. And you can also see even evidence of, there's lots of exposed bedrock in this region as well. So thinking about a little bit about what these sediments actually are, this is a simplified geologic map of this region that I know is still complicated, so I'll still walk you through this. And just to draw your eye initially to these more recent quaternary deposits. So in green, ringing the lake, we have these sort of wetland sediments. And then the whites and the grays are deposits that formed either at the same time as glaciers were on the landscape or we reworked glacial deposits. And so, again, there's lots of evidence on this landscape for past glacial events. And then what we're really interested in for this section of the talk are these sort of gray to purple units, which are most of the carbonate bedrock in the region or locally. So these are the Pucara group and the Casapelco formation, which are mostly marine limestones that have been uplifted and now form part of the Andean Cordillera. You could see even in the field again how exposed some of this bedrock is. And we collected a handful of bedrock samples when we were in the field in 2019, and so I will be showing data from those samples. So this is sort of their distribution in the catchment and the surrounding catchments. from where we collected. And then the last set of units that I'll point out are these pink units, which are where most of the sort of, these are mostly like sandstones and shales, and so this is where most of that clastic sediment is coming from that's reflected, that's sort of driving that glacial signature in the sedimentology. Okay, so thinking again about like our framework of how we've interpreted the interglacial carbonates, that interglacial framework works because we can sort of make these assumptions about the controlling factors on carbonate isotope values. But when we have detrital sediment entering the lake, this really messes with our ability to understand the isotope composition of these glacial carbonates. So we want a tool to be able to sort of pick out and hopefully remove the effect of detrital contamination on these glacial samples. And so what we'll be using is the clumped isotope temperature from carbonates with the assumption, and I'll show that these bedrock carbonates record sort of reordering warm burial temperatures, so temperatures outside of Earth's surface conditions. So you can sort of ignore the right-hand side of this graph for the moment, but this graph is showing the bedrock in the catchment, its clumped isotope temperature, as well as modern authigenic carbonates. So this grouping is the bedrock from those sites that I showed in one of the previous slides. And the bedrock has temperature, reflects carbonate temperature, clumped isotope temperatures around 70 degrees Celsius. And these are samples from modern lakes, both Junín and some of the other surrounding lakes. So these are modern authigenic carbonates. And they have a temperature of around 11 degrees Celsius, which is similar to mean annual air temperature, which is like around 6 or 7 degrees Celsius. So these are the authigenic carbonates are recording surface temperatures, and these bedrock carbonates are recording these reset burial temperatures. So there's very distinct groupings, or these two populations have very distinct clumped isotope temperatures. And so we can set up this sort of hypothesis or framework. So if we consider the glacial carbonates, if we think that the glacial carbonates are authigenic, if they're representing actual glacial temperatures, we expect that the clumped isotope temperature should be probably at the same temperature or cooler than modern interglacial lake water temperature. And that if we have a mixing between these two populations, we would have glacial carbonates somewhere kind of in the middle. And so looking at our data, we analyzed 4 samples, each from 3 different glacial periods. And what we see is 2 distinct populations of our glacial samples. The first population records these cooler temperatures that are similar to the present day, and we would interpret these as primarily authigenic in origin, versus this population with higher temperatures, which we're interpreting as some sort of mixture between the authigenic and detrital sources. And I also want to point out we analyzed, just a handful of samples from each of these glacial periods. But what we can see is that none of the glacial periods seem to be not having at least one sample that seems to have detrital carbonate in the sample. So this seems to be a pretty persistent problem across the different glacial periods. And so that leads to sort of the first conclusion from this part of the talk, which is that we think that at a minimum, we should be able to use these clumped isotope temperatures to screen samples for detrital contamination. And so we think that this should also be transferable to other types of carbonate systems. And so at a minimum, what we could do is potentially move forward with these low temperature samples, assuming that they have maybe negligible detrital contamination, and that would be at least informative and help sort of frame our strategy for moving forward with sort of paleoclimate reconstructions from the glacial periods. But like I said, this Junín record is like an incredible resource in terms of thinking about Andean climate over the last 700,000 years. And so it'd be really great if we could still do something make some sort of meaningful interpretation from these samples that seem to be contaminated by bedrock carbonate. So in the last little bit of the talk, I'm going to talk about our attempts to do that with this clumped isotope data. And to do that, we need to understand how much bedrock carbonate has been incorporated into these samples. Or we can think about it as the degree of contamination by bedrock carbonate. So I'm going to be doing that with an n-member mixing model. And so this is sort of this mixing equation. And what this is most simply saying is that the bulk sample, the sample that we would measure, is some fractional contribution of our authigenic carbonate and its isotope value, as well as the fractional contribution of the bedrock and its isotope value. So if we mix these two things together, we get something sort of in the middle. And we can model that numerically, going from sort of entirely authigenic, these cool temperatures, to 100% bedrock, these warmer temperatures. And we can think that if that sort of degree of contamination changes, if we have more bedrock, so here I'm representing that as FB, the fraction of bedrock in the sample. If we have a lot of bedrock, then we reflect warmer temperatures in our glacial samples, and if we have less, they'll be cooler. So thinking about how that might look schematically, we move sort of along this curve. And so we can also make this a little bit more robust. And what I'm doing here is modeling a synthetic data set with an n-member for each of these scenarios, and modeling basically with some degree of uncertainty in the n-member compositions, a bunch of possible mixing curves. So here I'm showing just 500 possible mixing curve solutions. And then what we can do is take a sample. So here for the synthetic data set, this is a 50-50 mixture of our authigenic and our bedrock sample, and prescribe some uncertainty. And so this is sort of analogous to what we might measure. We might measure some value with uncertainty. And I can take this data, the synthetic data, and project it into our mixing framework and get estimates for what percentage of the sample is bedrock in origin. And so here I'm showing a probability density function of the distribution of those points. And for our synthetic sample, which again was a 50-50 mix, this mixing framework gives us an estimate of about 50% plus or minus 8% of bedrock in this synthetic sample. So then we can go back to our mixing formula and rewrite it. So now I'm isolating the term for the authigenic n-member. This is what we basically want to be able to solve for in terms of being significant for climatic interpretations. If we look at the other parameters here, we've now estimated what the bedrock fraction would be from this mixing approach. And we can consider the bulk isotope composition of a sample and the bedrock isotope composition as values that can be measured. We can give those some value based on measurements. And so now we've got all of these right-hand parameters, and so we can solve for what this authigenic carbonate would be. So just continuing on this example of this synthetic data, the correct value for this sample, for the authigenic value, should be minus 12 based on the model conditions that I assigned. But what we would measure for this sample, for the bulk sample, would be about minus 8.5 per mil. So if we apply the equation from the previous slide to this sample data, we end up with an estimate or a modeled value for the authigenic 18O value of around minus 11.9 plus or minus about a per mil of uncertainty. And so we can think, I should also say this was just one example with the 50-50 synthetic mixture, but I did perform these calculations for mixtures of just 5% detrital contamination up to 95% contamination, and I'm happy to talk about those results if folks have questions later. But just for interest of time, moving to our observed data from Junín, from our glacial carbonates, and we can apply the same sort of mixing or unmixing framework to our glacial carbonates from Junín. So one of our relatively cooler temperature samples, estimating bedrock contamination of around 4%, plus or minus 4%. And then for these higher temperature samples, we can model and estimate the bedrock fraction of like 36% plus or minus 10 for this sample, and up to, upwards of 70% for this other sample here during the last glacial period. And then we can take that a step further and estimate the authogenic 18O values. And so this is still very much in the sort of preliminary work for this project. But overall, what we see, and this is consistent with our synthetic data, is that it maybe is not surprising, but the magnitude by which this correction increases as we assume that the bedrock fraction increases. That makes sense because you're making a larger correction to account for this contamination. The uncertainty in our corrected 18O value increases quite dramatically from, very low to just with this data set, upwards of 4 per mil, so quite large. And so this is sort of showing us that some of these samples, this approach may be really useful in terms of correcting for detrital contributions. But for some samples that are really highly contaminated, this might have too much uncertainty to necessarily have meaningful climate interpretation. So still a work in progress in terms of understanding ultimately what information we can get from these glacial samples from Junín, but I wanted to share sort of where we were on that. So just to conclude this part of the talk, the takeaway from this section is that at minimum, our clumped isotope temperatures should be able to be used to screen for detrital contamination, and then there's a possibility that we can even do more by accounting for the detrital component using this mixing approach. And so to sort of summarize the whole talk, or what I hope you take away with as sort of the biggest picture of this is that the Lake Junín core is a really amazing record of Andean climate, and can help us understand how the tropics responded to these global glacial interglacial cycles over the late Pleistocene and Holocene. And methodologically, that carbonate clumped isotopes and triple oxygen isotopes are valuable new tools for addressing paleoclimate and hydrologic questions. So I'll just also thank all of my collaborators on the Junín project, as well as my current lab at Yale, and also thanking the ICDP for all of the efforts drilling and collecting these cores, and the Peruvian government for authorizing collection of the Lake Junín cores. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.